Having nailed down the truth that human beings can't earn the righteousness of God by works, 4:115, Paul then illustrated how God can credit his righteousness to us. It is by our faith, a term which has gone through many changes of meaning over time. Mark Twain placed the following words on the lips of his character Pudd'nhead Wilson, an amateur detective with an uncommon love for facts that can be proved. Faith is believing what you know ain't so. Unfortunately, this has become the primary definition of faith in our time. Or, more precisely, faith is the firm belief in something for which there is no proof. But it was not always so. This particular definition of faith is the result of a philosophical shift, a fundamental change in the way people think about the universe that began as far back as the 13th century and the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. His writings set the spiritual and physical realms into distinct categories and suggested ways to prove that they were connected. This is profoundly important because until then, nearly everyone perceived the universe as the result of simultaneous natural and supernatural causes. In other words, people generally presumed that all events were the result of both physics and the actions of God or gods in pagan cultures. Tragically, what began with Aquinas' conceptual division of the spiritual and physical realms has become an ugly divorce. Most every philosophical system since his time has tried to explain the relationship between the seen and unseen as though the two cannot live in the same intellectual house. Eventually, a 20th century philosophy called existentialism suggested that the gap between the two realms cannot be bridged intellectually, that neither science nor logic can lead one to experience spiritual realities. According to existentialists, the spiritual realm is so completely other that one must defy all logic and leap across the gap. One must take a blind leap of faith and trust that something instead of nothing is there. Now, the most common understanding of faith is non-rational belief, or believing what you know ain't so. Faith, as the Bible presents it, is anything but non-rational. Faith often transcends proof, but that's not to say that faith calls us to shut off our brains, ignore logic, and blindly believe what we hope to be true. To help make this clearer, substitute the word trust for faith. Exercising the kind of faith described in the Bible is a choice to trust something or someone. You exercise faith each time you board an airplane, or allow a physician to perform a procedure on your body while you are anesthetized. Having reasonable expectation that the aircraft is designed and built correctly, and that the crew is competent to operate it, you climb aboard with every expectation to land safely at your destination. Having reasonable assurance that your doctor is both knowledgeable and experienced, you submit your unconscious body to his or her care, expecting to be better off than before. No one can prove that your travel will end safely or that you will be healed. However, what you have seen allows you to trust what you cannot yet see. In time, experience reinforces the decision to trust. Eventually, repeated experience allows faith in air travel or medicine to grow strong. Faith, or trust, allows us to move beyond what we see in order to experience what cannot yet be seen. Nevertheless, faith is not a leap, and faith is never blind. Paul illustrated this truth in Abraham's relationship with God. 4:16-17. Paul's expression, "for this reason," establishes a logical connection between what he had just written and what he will declare next. Just as wages are obtained through work and failure to obey the law reaps God's wrath, grace is received through faith. Grace and faith must go together because grace is utterly alien to our world. It's a miraculous act of God, not unlike parting seas, Exodus 14:13-31, and raining bread from heaven, Exodus 16:1-7, in which divine power supersedes all other forces. And to illustrate the supernatural dynamic of God's grace and genuine faith, The apostle again pointed to the experience of Father Abraham. In the same way that Abraham is the father of the Hebrews and their covenant with God, he is the father of all who would be joined to God through trust in him. Abraham's life was a journey in faith. It all started when God chose him from among the Chaldeans, an idolatrous civilization nestled in the cradle of humanity. No one knows why God selected this particular Chaldean. All we know is that it was not due to any particular merit in the man. The Lord promised to give the man a large parcel of land, a burgeoning progeny, and an everlasting blessing. So, the future patriarch traveled up the Tigris-Euphrates basin, over the crest of the Fertile Crescent, and down the Jordan Valley. Decades later, the aging Chaldean despaired. Nearing the age of 100, having seen his promised land sick with famine, General 12:10-20, his family divided by greed, General 13:5-12, and his shalom shattered by intruders, General 14:5-24, Abram, exalted father, still had no children. To encourage Abram, the Lord appeared to him in a dream and confirmed that he would indeed become the father of a multitude of nations. General 17:4. To seal his promise, the Lord changed Abram's name to Abraham, father of a multitude, and his wife's name from Sarai, contentious, to Sarah, princess. The old man responded the way most of us would. He laughed. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." General 17:17-18. Who is Ishmael? The product of Abraham's lapse in faith. 13 years earlier, Abram and Sarai decided the divine plan needed a little human intervention. We're all good at that. A careful study of God's promise didn't say anything about Sarai being the mother of Abram's covenant children. Maybe he intended a surrogate. Childbearing had become physically impossible for her, but not for Abram. Perhaps they weren't thinking creatively enough. So, Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. General 16:2-3. But the plan backfired. It always does when we decide to help God fulfill His promises. Hagar and Ishmael became a source of bitter contention in the patriarch's household, far from the blessing he had thought to grasp through his own efforts. So, when the Lord clarified that Sarai's withered womb would indeed be the source of his multitude, Abram could not suppress an incredulous laugh. General 17:17. As you would expect, when Sarah later heard the news from the lips of angels, she laughed as well. General 18:12. We can't be too hard on Abram and Sarai. Because we have the Bible, we already know God to be the all-powerful creator of the universe. But they knew almost nothing about Him at the beginning. Then, as the Lord revealed more and more of His character and power, their faith grew in response. Far from a blind leap, theirs was a journey of faith led by the Lord in which trust was required in small measures at first. Each choice to trust was rewarded with blessing and a greater understanding of God. As He proved faithful, their faith matured. Note the angel's response to the incredulous laughter of the aging couple. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? General 18:14. Our limited, nature-bound perspective would have us focus on the fact that 90-year-old women cannot have babies. But God is not bound by the limitations of the natural world. He is supernatural, above nature, both able and willing to accomplish what no one else can. A few chapters later in the story of Abraham and Sarah, we read the words, "And the Lord attended to Sarah like he said he would, and did for her what he said he would." General 21:1, my translation. The aged woman then conceived, carried her child 9 months, that must have been a sight, and gave birth to a son, whom they named Yitzchak. He laughed. We know him as Isaac. Sarah commented on the irony of Isaac's name when she declared, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." General 21:6-7. How wonderful to see her laughter transformed from scoffing to joy, from cynicism to celebration. So, what does this have to do with Romans 4:16-25? Everything, especially for all Jewish readers. Paul had earlier declared, "For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law." 3:28. He then demonstrated that Abraham's righteousness came through faith. 4:1-15. And faith was required because Abraham could no more obtain righteousness through natural means than a 90-year-old woman could conceive a child. God's covenant with Abraham promised a multitude of descendants. The patriarch tried to claim the promise through natural means, Sarah's handmaid Hagar, but to no avail. The only thing he had to offer was his belief in the character and power of God to do as was promised. And in time, God sovereignly, supernaturally fulfilled his promise without any help from Abraham or Sarah. 4:18. The wording, "in hope against hope," is a paradoxical turn of phrase that some use to support their leap of faith approach to Christian belief. Paul meant by this expression to separate natural hope from supernatural hope. In other words, Abraham placed his hope in the supernatural power of God to accomplish what is hopeless by any natural means. However, his hope was not a blind leap. It was quite reasonable for him to believe in God's supernatural power because he had seen it in action before. Furthermore, God's faithfulness allowed Abraham to trust him without having to know specifically how the future would unfold. Paul used Abraham's hope against hope as a pattern for the kind of faith we are to have. Becoming good enough for heaven is not something we can achieve by any human, natural means. It is something we can only receive through faith. However, this faith is neither a blind leap nor a choice to trust against all reason or proof. God has proven himself trustworthy. Abraham and Sarah experienced a long period of waiting, which might seem cruel from a human point of view. But the Lord used the delay to accomplish 2 important objectives. First, he wanted Abraham and all of his descendants to understand that his covenant was divine in its origin and supernatural in its fulfillment. Second, he wanted, through their personal experience, to cultivate Abraham and Sarah's faith as they gained greater knowledge of his holy character and limitless power. 4:19-21. I am encouraged to see Paul's divinely inspired comment on the faith of Abraham and Sarah. As I read their story, I see multiple examples of wobbly-legged faith. Yet God looked not so much at their faltering growth, but at their ultimate destination. From our perspective, they wavered quite a lot along the way. The Lord looked instead upon the fact that they arrived despite the presence of natural hindrances. They may have laughed, but that laughter did not nullify their trust. The aging couple took full account of their decaying bodies and waning sexual potency as they, together, chose to believe God. Despite the occasional setbacks, Abraham's mind remained undivided, weak in human understanding, but always trained upon God and no other. Gradually, Abraham's experience with God gave him greater ability to trust him despite the apparent contradictions that surrounded him. His trust was empowered to the point that he was able to believe without reservation that God would fulfill all that he had promised. And one last trial, not mentioned in this passage but fully in view to all who know his story of faith, proved the mettle of Abraham's trust. Think of it as the man's final exam. Several years after the birth of Isaac, Abraham and Sarah's only child, and the very embodiment of God's covenant promise, the Lord commanded him to do something humanly unthinkable. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. General 22:2. Without hesitation, although with a great anguish I have no doubt, the faithful father obeyed. As the two approached the appointed place of sacrifice, Isaac, who was no fool, asked the obvious question, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" General 22:7. His father's answer could be construed as coy, but I see in his words a choice to trust in the goodness of God without having to understand when or how he would fulfill his promise. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. General 22:8. If this had been Abraham's first experience with God, his faith could be considered a giant leap. Instead, it is the culmination of a journey, initiated by God, led by God, sustained by God, cultivated by God, and completed by God, with, of course, Abraham's willing participation. The patriarch's fully developed faith yielded the fruit of obedience, to which the Lord responded, "In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." General 22:18, 4:22-25. From a natural human perspective, one might think that Abraham's obedience to the command of God earned him the covenant blessing. But Paul's illustration from Mount Moriah proves that Abraham's obedience was simply a visible manifestation of his faith, and that it was his faith that allowed him to receive God's gift of righteousness. Paul belabored the point in order to make an important connection. Abraham is the father of the Hebrews, but not of them only. He is the father of all who receive God's grace through faith, and are declared righteous through no merit of their own. The only difference between Abraham and us is what, specifically, we are to believe. Abraham was called to obey the command of God to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, with the understanding that God will provide. General 22:8. We are called to believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, he who was delivered over because of our transgressions, and was raised because of our justification. Rom 4:24-25. This is the gospel in its most straightforward terms. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried. Then Christ was raised from the dead and was seen by his disciples, including one meeting in which he interacted with a gathering of more than 500 followers. 1 Corinthians 15:3-6. And by trusting in God's provision despite the apparent finality of death, we hope against hope and receive the gift of eternal life. Application: Romans 4:16-25. Becoming a big godder, Paul freely admitted that the justification of a sinful person was impossible, at least in human terms. He then used Abraham and Sarah's inability to have children to illustrate another key principle in salvation. The promise of God and the principle of grace make all things possible, even the impossible. God has the ability to give life to the dead and create something out of nothing. 4:16-17. God promised Abraham that he would be the progenitor of multitudes, nations, in fact. But many years passed, as did Sarah's ability to bear children. Long after it became physically impossible for her to conceive, God reaffirmed his promise and, in hope against hope, Abraham trusted him. This wasn't a blind faith. The old man acknowledged the impossibility of the circumstance, yet trusted in the greatness of his God. 4:18-21. Abraham worshipped and served a big God. He understood his Maker to be immensely more powerful than any human impossibility. And from him we learn two important lessons about faith. First, genuine faith is strengthened when we must wait on God's promises to be fulfilled. When we must wait to receive something, the Lord, the grace of God, Romans 3:21, 5:21, has promised, we gradually turn our eyes away from circumstances to look instead on the greatness and faithfulness of God. Second, genuine faith is directly proportional to our knowledge of God. As we more fully comprehend His nature, our faith cannot help but grow. Robert Dick Wilson is mostly remembered for his outstanding achievements in linguistics at Princeton Theological Seminary. He learned more than 45 ancient languages in his quest to understand the Scriptures more accurately. But his students remember him more for his unique approach to evaluating their preaching. He didn't critique their ability to parse verbs or dissect ancient turns of a phrase. He didn't analyze their scholarship or pay attention to their charisma. Instead, he listened for another, more crucial quality. After hearing one particular student preach, the professor remarked, "I am glad that you are a big Godder. When my boys come back, I come to see if they are big Godders or little Godders, and then I know what their ministry will be." How big is your God? Are you tossed about by the waves of circumstance in a sea of chaos, or do you understand that God has every matter under His divine control, and that He has a purpose for every event you encounter? Do you accept the finality of impossibilities, or do you allow God to have the final say in those matters? When you pray, do you shy away from asking God to accomplish big things, or do you trust that He is not only able, but very likely willing to dramatically and supernaturally act on your behalf? The size of your God has everything to do with your answers. Who is directing your future, no matter what your age? A puny God with no imagination and little power? Or do you serve an infinitely creative, immensely powerful, gigantic God? Let me challenge you to become a big Godder. Begin by committing yourself to knowing Him as He is.